Once upon a time in a quaint little town, there was a small gray kitten named Oliver. Oliver had soft, fluffy fur and the most curious blue eyes. He lived with a kind old woman named Mrs. Peabody, who had found him as a stray when he was just a tiny ball of fluff. Oliver and Mrs. Peabody shared a warm home, filled with the scent of baking bread and the soft hum of old-fashioned radios. One sunny afternoon, while Mrs. Peabody was tending to her garden, Oliver decided to explore beyond the familiar confines of their yard. He had always been intrigued by the world outside, and was particularly fascinated by the chirping birds and fluttering butterflies. As he followed a particularly bright butterfly, he ventured further and further from home, until the garden was just a distant memory. Oliver soon found himself in a bustling park, full of people and other animals. Everything was so new and exciting. He chased after squirrels, played with fallen leaves, and even tried to make friends with a very aloof cat who sat on a park bench. But as the sun began to set, Oliver realized that he didn't know how to get back home. As twilight descended, Oliver's excitement turned to anxiety. The park, which had seemed so welcoming and vast during the day, now felt intimidating and confusing. The once bright butterfly was nowhere to be seen, and the park's familiar faces had disappeared. Oliver felt a lump in his tiny throat as he mewed softly, hoping someone would hear him. Meanwhile, Mrs. Peabody was growing more worried with each passing minute. She had noticed Oliver's absence and had been searching for him, calling his name as she walked through the neighborhood. When she finally reached the park, she asked people if they had seen a small gray kitten. Many people offered kind words and joined in the search, but as night fell, they had to return home. Back at the park, Oliver was starting to lose hope. But just as he was about to curl up under a bench, he heard a familiar voice. It was Mrs. Peabody, calling his name with a mix of relief and concern. Oliver's ears perked up, and he followed the sound of her voice, mewing loudly in response. When Mrs. Peabody spotted Oliver, her heart swelled with joy. She scooped him up into her arms, hugging him tightly. "Oh, Oliver, I was so worried about you," she said, tears of happiness welling up in her eyes. Oliver nuzzled against her, purring contentedly. Mrs. Peabody carried him home, and the comforting aroma of their house greeted them both as they walked through the door. That night, as Oliver curled up in his cozy bed, he knew he was safe and sound. He had ventured out into the world and found his way back, thanks to his loving Mrs. Peabody and the kindness of strangers who had helped in his search. From then on, Oliver was content to stay closer to home, but he never lost his adventurous spirit. And every time he heard the chirping of a butterfly or saw the flutter of a leaf, he would remember his little adventure, and the warmth of returning to where he truly belonged.